Welcome everybody. So today in this sessions we'll majorly discuss about the Azure Static Web App functionalities or how we can use Azure Static Web App during the as a deployment platform. So for this sessions we are demonstrations we are basically developing a one static web app applications on basis of Azure Blazor WebAssembly with the help of Azure functions, and then we will deploy it in the Azure Static Web App. So before the start, I am basically right now working as a solution architect in V5 Sub Pune, and also a Microsoft certified trainer in MVP, and having around more than 12 years of experience in the IT industry. So in today's sessions, we have three main topics which we will discuss. One is the Blazor WebAssembly applications. What is the concept or how we can use it? Second one is the Azure functions. And third one is the Azure a class project library sharing code. And then we'll deploy that entire this first three part as a combinations of applications into the Azure Static Web App. So before going to start about any details, first we need to understand about the Blazor WebAssembly. I'm not going to very deep details here because Blazor regarding the Blazor framework or architecture or the Blazor assembly part. I'm simply giving some basic overview about this topic so that we can understand why we are using this. So in 2018, Microsoft first introduced this new framework called Blazor. With the other frameworks like MVC or .NET framework as a platform in the .NET framework platform. So Blazor is basically supports the web open source based architecture with a .NET web based framework through which we can develop any web applications which can directly run on the client side. The one of the major benefits of Blazor framework is that we can develop the applications.
Hello, Debasis. Can you hear me? Is anyone can hear me? Uh, Debasis, at least I'm not able to hear you. Hello, Debasis. We are unable to hear you.
Hello, am I connected? Am I audible? No?
Yes, yes, yes. Now we are
Yeah,
able to
yeah.
hear you.
Oh, sorry. So there is some network. So, so during this session, we will discuss about this Blazor framework. So, in case of Blazor, the server side part is not essentially required, but we can use it as a part of our applications. And Also, we can use the same code as a shared code so that that same code can be used in different projects or different applications. So in Blazor, basically support two types of applications. One is the normal web app based applications, another is the WebAssembly based applications. So WebAssembly always treated as a low level based assembly programming language, which is also known as a web standard. And most of the times we use this WebAssembly part because due to the some performance related code or performance or high speed related performance, because those part is running just like a native machine's code and executed by the browser directly. So the high level language which used by the web assembly part can be developed for any web application. So in Blazor, we can develop the applications which can be converted during the deployment or during the publish time as a web assembly part and directly run in the browser, just like a native code. So for those parts, we can use our conventional server-side languages like C Sharp or WebSharp, or other client-side languages like HTML, CSS, etc. So when we run the Blazor WebAssembly, we normally use the version-based applications in our .NET runtime based on that. And so whenever we first time use the Blazor app in a particular browser machines, at that time, dependencies related to that applications like .NET runtimes and everything is downloaded for the at the client browser A. So as a first experience as a user, they may for the first time when they using that particular applications or opening that particular applications by using a URL, that is for the first time it will take some more time, but on the once that dependency is downloaded in the client browser side and cache, then those dependencies is used from directly from the cache of the browser. So at the next on time onward, it will automatically instantly open, so user does not have any time problem or performance issue. But yeah, for the first time, definitely for Blazor assembly apps, it will take some time to download those dependencies and a runtime environment. The application is always executed on the browser using the UI thread and handles all the event-based processes. And for any type of static files like CSS, JS files, images, etc., all are that considered as static files and downloaded. And if we require any backend support like API consume support, then we can also use the server-side files by in the Blazor WebAssembly application, or we can use direct API consumption there. So also we can create applications with a backend app options so that server is server-side files as a hosted as a Blazor WebAssembly application. So in case of Blazor WebAssembly, there is some pros and cons, obviously. So first one is there is no dependency once the app is downloaded into the client machine from the server, and so it even the server is goes offline and not available, then also the application will run able to run because all the runtime environment and dependencies is downloaded and the client machines are available. And also, it does not require any ASP.NET Core Web Server for hosting these types of applications. And we can use any serverless deployment mechanism like CDN to host these applications because these are not dependent on any particular server. And we normally using the client resources and capabilities fully. But there is also cons like application is dependent on the capability of the browser. So if the client or user browser is the old form dated, uh, some browser version is old form dated, or old browser version is used, then maybe that application is not work properly. If those browser not supported the features of the Blazor OS. Also, the application is open for the first time. It downloads the entire app-related resources along with the runtime libraries and dependencies. So sometimes it takes some more time to download and open the application. And as per the application side, it may take some longer to load the application for the first time, but this behavior is only for the first time. And when as the application is entirely depends upon the client machine, so hardware and software configurations for the client machine is one of the minimum software configuration is required for them. And when we consider any Blazor WebAssembly hosted in Azure static apps and try to consume data from an API endpoint, like if I need to send some data or receive some data into that WebAssembly apps, and I want to consume an API, in that case, we need to use the Azure function. Azure function is one of the another features which is provided on-demand serverless code and completely managed architecture. And also we can independently use the Azure functions as an on-demand scaling. And it also provides multiple programming language like C#, Node.js, JavaScript, etc. So we can define Azure function in different languages. And it basically based on the trigger and binding concept. And also it supports the cross-platform and open source platform, both. So the major benefits of Azure Function is Azure Functions programming model is very simple and flexible. It always provides different types of trigger, and on basis of those triggers, we need to define our Azure function. And it does not require too much of code or boilerplate code. We can whatever the required logic or business logic we need to define. We just need to define those part and write down those related code, and then we can execute directly. So for any particular Azure function, we does not need to create an entire project set of everything. We just need to define a particular functions file, write down our business logic as a function, and then directly execute it. And it is much more less costly compared to the other Azure app-based services. And does not need to manage any servers. We can directly host it in the Azure platform as a service. And also, Michael Azure provides the dynamic scaling and everything for this service. So now the concern is the Azure Static Apps. Azure Static App is basically is not one type of app service which providing the web hosting functionalities for any static content like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, just like other Azure apps. So if I developed a web applications I want to host in a public domain or in a Azure infrastructure, I can host that applications as a Azure app service. But at the same time, I can create that applications as a Azure Static App because the difference between these two that it is much more faster and easily created. Creation process is much more easier. And the most important part is Azure Static Apps is maintain its own pipeline mechanism by its own. So whenever we push any changes, automatically it activate its pipeline, build the applications, check if there is any error or is occur or not, and once everything is fine, push the changes to the main server. So for that part, we does not need to maintain any manual operations or any extra effort. Just everything is done by the Azure Static Web App infrastructure. So it basically integrated with the as API functions for Azure functions. And also by default, it provides the CI/CD process with the help of GitHub or Azure DevOps functionality. And also, whatever the static files we are using in our applications, those are the globally distributed and available. And it also provides a free SSL certificate when we hosted that part. We can create our custom domains and also generated staging versions powered by the pull request. Means whenever we create any PR or pull request for due to some changes, at that time, the pipeline automatically verified that changes and deploy that entire change with the new changes in a staging version. And if we verify that staging versions after verifications, once we merge that changes to the main branch, then only that changes is available in our main productions or main master branch deployment part. And also it provides supports different framework like Angular, React, Blazor, static like HTML, or some. So this is the one architectural pattern that whenever any code changes is performed, a GitHub actions is triggered, and through that GitHub actions, that code changes triggered by the Azure Web Apps CI/CD pipeline. And then as per the changes, it will automatically move the changes in the staging versions. And once we approve that or merge that PR, then automatically that entire changes again trigger and updated in the application. So for this entire mechanism, it does not need to create anything else. Everything is automatically created when we create or deploy the Azure Static Web App. Okay. So for these systems, I have already created one Azure, oh sorry, no, not Azure, Blazor WebAssembly applications and Azure functions. So this is the one Azure Blazor WebAssembly applications which I have created, and it contains one index page. In this index page, if we see, I have already write down the code related to display some information. So this is the extension of this file is the reg.reger. And in this file, I have provided both HTML code and also for some server-side code. So in Blazor part, we can write down both type of code means.
Debasis, we are unable to hear you if you are speaking in case.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yeah. So I think there is some Bluetooth device problem. Just disable my Bluetooth. Okay, so whenever I click on the Azure functions and provide any functions name, so these are the different triggers is available in the Azure functions part. So we can select any of the trigger type here. So either it's a HTTP trigger or HTTP based OpenAI trigger, whatever the trigger we have selected, and accordingly we can add these functions code. So for this example, demo, I have created one Azure functions, which basically is a HTTP based trigger. This is basically the HTTP based trigger, and it basically is a get return me a get type API, and which return me some data. So in these functions, I have created a JSON string data and return this data as a JSON format. Okay. So if I individually run these applications, mean only the Azure functions in my local, so it will give me one URL. Whenever we run the Azure functions and by using Visual Studio, it will give us the every endpoint URL. So I just need to copy this URL and say open a browser and simply paste this URL. So if that URL is accessible, then the response, whatever the get response, so data is available. Okay. So for that purpose, I have created two different projects. One is the Blazor assembly project, another is the Azure function project. So right now, this project is not linked with this Blazor Azure function project. Blazor WebAssembly only right now access the static JSON file, which is the events or JSON file, read the data and populate that pages. Okay. So now we are going to host these applications in the Azure Static Web Apps and then check how we can use the pipeline mechanism to update any changes. Okay. So for that part, first we need to push these code changes in a GitHub repository. So I have already pushed this GitHub repository code. So this is my GitHub repository, which I have created, and all three codes I have already pushed. Okay. So whenever we create any Azure function static apps through using the GitHub repository, automatically that CI pipeline information will be available under this action section, action tab. So now first I'll create a Azure Static Web App. So for that, once we need to create or log in our Azure Web Portal, and then click on the Azure Static Apps. Or you can search if it's not available in the recently, then you can click search here Azure Static Web App. So if we click it here, then this is the window, and then we need to click on create. So create at the time of create, we first need to create a resource group because say global is it. Okay. So I'll click it. It's a resource group which contains all the resources related to these applications. We'll provide a demo name of the applications. So I'll use the same name. Here. Okay. Now we can use the need to choose the hosting plan. So there is a two types of hosting plan. One is the free for personal users, and another is a standard, which will be chargeable. So if we want to using the custom domain, in that case, we need to use the standard hosting plan. And for free of the hosting plan, everything is available, but we cannot change the custom domain name. Whatever the domain name is generated automatically, that we need to use. Okay. So I'll be using this, and then we can select the staging server that where we are using which environment staging environment we want to use. Central US or East Asia. So I will select our nearest staging environment infrastructure. Now we need to select which deployment mechanism we want to use. Means as I have already mentioned that Azure Static App supports both GitHub and Azure DevOps, both types. So if we want to access code from the GitHub repository, then we need to choose GitHub. Or if our code is under the Azure DevOps part, then we need to select Azure DevOps, whatever. Okay. So if we select GitHub, then we, as I have already connected with my GitHub account, so that's why my account details is displayed here. But if I have not, we are not connected, or if I'm not logged in with my GitHub account, then there is a logging button will appear, and we need to connect with the GitHub account through this portal. This connection is established. Our GitHub account link is available here. So if that in under GitHub account, if there is a multiple organizations based code repository maintained, then we need to choose the related organizations code. Like I have choose my personal part. And then whatever the public repositories is available here, every repositories is available is here. So from there, I'll select our required repository name, say global Azure Day 2022. So whenever you select the repository name, it automatically displayed the branch name since it has only one master branch. So that's why it is displaying master. But if there is a multiple branch, so then and if we want, I want to deploy it for on the basis of a particular branch, then I can select that branch from this dropdown. And then we need to select the framework, which framework based deployment we require. Like see, there are different types of framework is available: Angular, Blazor, Next.js, Vue, HTML, React. Also, some static site generator part is also available: Vue Express, Hugo, Gatsby, etc. So the applications is used that particular framework we need to use. So in our case, I'll select Blazor. If the application is Angular based or React based, we can choose any one of them. After once we select the framework, we need to provide three informations. One is the application locations in your GitHub repository. Second one, if this applications contains any API endpoints or API project, then provide the API locations informations. and in which folder the output locations is exist. Means normally it is the W3 root. So if we want that our output locations is different, means index.html or some static file, CSS, JS, or images are stored in that some different folder, not in W3 root in our folder structure wise, then we need to provide this folder name. Okay. So I'll return back to my application. So here, if I go back to my code, so under this code, there are three folders I have used. One is the Blazor repository code, Blazor code, and this one is the applications API Azure function code. So I'll simply copy this name first client side and copy and paste here. Remove this client word and over. So I'll try the name Azure Data 2023. And in the API part, the folder name is this one. So those name must be the identical name from there. And it contains a default W3 folder. So once we provide this information, it automatically create a workflow file information. And if we want to see what workflow file information is provided, we can see here. So this is the workflow file, which automatically generated by the Azure Static App and maintains all the deployment processes. Okay. So now I'll click on create and review button. Simply click on the create. So once we creating the resources, it will take 1 or 2 minutes to create. So once the resource is created, then we need to cross verify that either the deployment is done or not. So normally the deployment of Azure Static App is much more faster. It is much so as it is on there, the deployment is completed. Now, if I click on the go to resource button, it will navigate me to the Azure Static App resources, and there is a one URL icon is here. So this is the hosted URL of these applications. As we are using a pre-plan, so that's why it's a predefined URL. But if we are using a standard plan, then we can definitely modify this URL domain and we can use a custom domain. Okay, so simply I copy this URL and open a new tab and paste it and try to access the website. So now it is on that the website is live, but waiting for the content. That means the deployment is not happening. So what is happening? So just now go back to your GitHub repository part and refresh the page and click on actions button. So you can see that there is already one CI/CD pipeline workflow is started. So it basically entirely build your applications, deploy it, get and deploy it, and then host it in your application. So this deployment process normally takes 1 or 2 minutes because your entire code is built and then they publish and everything, that entire process. So if you drill down these processes, you can find out what are the steps it is running. So entire pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, is automatically generated and followed here. Like set up the job, copy, run installs, and if we go back, go to details part of this part, we can find that it will install the framework and then install the deploy the applications and then copy the files to the hosted domain, everything. So sometimes it will take 1 to 2 minutes to complete this deployment. Okay, so let happen. So first we'll deploy it. In the meantime, I'll make some changes in my code. So now once this code is deployed in the site, it will access this data from my JSON file. But now I want to change my entire code base to so that this code so that I can access from my Azure Functions API. So for that part, I'll comment this line and uncomment this one line. So this is the line where I can use the HTTP service to get read from the API endpoint, that is API.get sessions. Why I have provided this name? Because this is my Azure functions name, which the functions which I have defined. This is the get sessions API. Okay. So I have changed this, and then I'll click go back to the programs and convert it to the environmental URL. Right now it is hosted in the hard-coded base URL. So as we are using a API endpoint, so we need to use the host environment base URL. So I'll comment it these two lines of code and I'll comment the related host URL related URL so that whenever it try to invoke this URL, it directly pick up the Azure hosted Azure functions URL and access this part. OK, so before pushing this change, I'll create a one new branch, then add API endpoint. So I'll keep a one branch. So I'll push these changes as a part of my branch. So now see the deployment is completed. OK, so if I go back to the actions, so deployment is done. So once I now return back to that particular page and simply click on refresh. So it will display the content. So if we inspect the element directly and network automatically, if we click, we can see that only the event it will fetching the data from the event.json. So still the data is coming as a static part, no dynamic part. Data is coming from a JSON files. So now we are trying to host these applications, these two changes, and say add API resource. I'll put a command and push these changes. OK. So once I push these changes, I'll return back to my GitHub part. So the changes is completed, but there is a no automatic actions is created because as I have created a branch, so I need to create a pull request. So once I click create a new pull request, I'll create the pull request. OK, so once I click the pull request, you can see we automatically it started the Azure's pipeline automatically. And so if I return back to the action tab, it will show that one pipeline automatically invoked again action flow regarding that pull request. This is not in the main branch. It is activated on the local branch, that new branch which I have created. So during this pull request, it will that entire pipeline will execute again and give us provide a staging environment URL where these new changes will be hosted. And we can validate the changes that everything is OK or not or perfectly working for our applications or not. And if we agree, then only we can merge these changes to the main branch and then again the deployment pipeline will activate it and deploy the entire changes in the applications. So this is the pipeline deployment. So it start step one by one, starting deploying everything. So yeah, it will downloading that .NET Framework version 6, everything, whatever the dependencies, everything is in my downloading and then deploying it. So it may take 1 or 2 minutes time. So this is the one of the major advantage of Azure Static App that during the each and every PR pull request, we can obtain a different staging environment. So before merging the code, we can verify the changes in a published environment as a published site. And if we satisfy, then only we can merge. So this is the one of the major benefits of Azure Static App because in for other cases, we if the code is successfully built, successful everything, then we can merge and then after that only deployment is occur. Otherwise, we need to maintain our different environment like dev environment or Q environment. But in Azure Static App part, it will automatically maintained by the Azure infrastructure. And for each and every pull request, it provides us a staging different URL, hosting URL. So dependencies is completed. So deployment is done. It will improve creating the staging URL. So now it is uploading the changes. Once it is completed, it will give us the new URL. Yeah, so just checking. So I'll expand this build and deploy third pipeline and scroll down industrial. So this is our staging environment. So we can use this URL as a part of our staging enrollment URL. So this is the URL which is used for the staging part. So if we click here, so now obviously there is no difference between these two applications. The only difference is source. So if I go back to the network part and refresh the page again, we can find that there is a new endpoint is introduced, that is the get sessions. But the previous one, which we have already opened, this is our existing published URL, which we have already posted in the applications. In that part, that URL again, if we use the same uh, activities, still it is fetching data from the event.json. That so this is the two different URLs. This is a staging part. So until or unless we merge our code changes, that changes will not push in the main branch. So as a user or as a testing part, we can use this entire URL to check the changes that everything is okay or anything is broken or not in our applications, and then only we can 100% sure that application is perfectly working. Then only we can move this URL to publish site. So for that, we just simply need to perform the approve the PR. We just need to merge this PR. So whenever we merge this PR, so this is done. So whenever we merge this PR, automatically, I'll merge. I'll close the PR. Once it is merged, so those changes is automatically available here. So this way we can use, but until this changes is also the temporary changes, and it contains 24 hours for the staging URL. So once the next deployment is done, automatically the previous staging environment will be destroyed. So this is the all about the demo. So in this endpoint, the entire code base is exist. So if anyone wants to check these code applications, they can use access this one. So that's all from my part. If anyone have any queries or questions, they can ask me now.
Thank you, Debashish, for showing us how we can just develop and publish a Blazor WebAssembly app and a .NET API with Azure Static Web Apps. It was really very informative session.
Thank you, Minda.
Guys, if you have any queries, then you can just unmute yourself or you can just post your queries in chat.
Yeah.